So this is the pharmacologic classifications of the antibiotics that we need to cover. And so there's a couple ways of looking at this. You can look at the distinctions by target or mechanism of action. So there are drugs that are cell wall inhibitors, basically go after the cell wall of the bacteria. There are drugs that inhibit the protein synthesis, and there are drugs that inhibit the nucleic acid synthesis. And so within that, there are subdivisions. And a lot of these subdivisions are based on the medicinal chemistry of these compounds. Antibiotics, excuse me, and chemotherapy, as in cancer chemotherapy, are the two divisions that have a large amount of distinctions based on chemistry, not so much based on mechanism. Okay, and the opposite is true for all of the other drugs that we'll learn about, excuse me, over the next year and a half. And so the cell wall inhibitors, the main group of drugs are the beta-lactam agents, and so they all have the same beta-lactam ring structure within their chemistry. And so you don't need to know the chemical structures, but you need to know that that's where that comes from. So penicillins, and the reason we call them penicillins is that there are different generations of penicillins, and the same could be said for cephalosporins. Carbapenems, excuse me, and monobactams are also within that cell wall inhibitor realm, and they have a beta-lactam. Glycopeptides, of course, are a unique chemical moiety, but they do inhibit the cell wall, so that's why they're grouped within that classification. Drugs that inhibit protein synthesis are listed there. Those are your macrolides, aminoglycosides, tetracycline, chloramphenicol. And then finally, drugs that affect the nucleic acid synthesis include your fluoroquinolones, as well as trimethoprim and sulfonamides. This is a nice summary diagram showing the targets where all these drugs inhibit, and then individual drugs that kind of fall under that category. So the drugs that inhibit the cell wall synthesis are all listed here. Yes, you do need to know that. Drugs that inhibit protein synthesis are listed here. Drugs that disrupt the cytoplasmic membrane are listed here. Inhibition of general metabolic pathways. These are basically drugs that inhibit RNA synthesis as well. You can probably combine these two lists. This particular diagram has them separated. And of course, there are some drugs that just simply don't fit, and those are listed here. We won't really cover these in any detail. This is another diagram. I think this one's a little bit better because it shows not only the mechanism, but the nuances between specific drugs. And so even within the protein synthesis inhibitors, we've got drugs that inhibit the 50S ribosomal subunit, and then we've got drugs that inhibit the 30S ribosomal subunit. And you do need to know that. For some reason, STEP does like to distinguish between those two nuances. And so this is more of a kind of a concept map in terms of where all these antimicrobials have their main effects.